For more than a century, the Vanderbilt name did not simply belong to a family. It loomed over New York like an invisible skyline. Long before glass towers and penthouse culture defined elite living, the Vanderbilts dictated where wealth gathered, how it moved, and who was allowed inside its gates. Their mansions once stretched along Fifth Avenue, like private kingdoms, monuments to an age when money spoke louder than law. But quietly, almost without public debate, the family helped usher in a new form of power, one that would change elite life forever. Not in sprawling estates behind iron fences, but stacked floor by floor, hidden in plain sight. The Vanderbilt apartments were not just buildings. They were a declaration to the public. These apartments symbolized progress. They were marketed as refined, modern, efficient, an answer to a rapidly growing city that could no longer bend entirely to the will of old money dynasties. But behind that polished narrative was something far more deliberate. These residences were designed to preserve dominance in a city that was becoming unpredictable, crowded, and increasingly hostile to excessive displays of wealth. Where mansions invited scrutiny, apartments offered discretion. Where palaces demanded attention, luxury apartments dissolved into the cityscape, shielding their occupants from judgment while keeping privilege intact. The shift was subtle, but its consequences were enormous. Elite apartment living did not emerge from necessity. It emerged from strategy. The Vanderbilts understood that power no longer needed to be loud. It needed to be insulated. In these buildings, wealth could observe the city without engaging with it. Private elevators replaced grand staircases. Service quarters replaced servants' wings. Privacy became the ultimate luxury, and isolation became a form of security. What looked like architectural innovation was, in reality, social engineering. Yet the story of these apartments is darker than their limestone facades suggest. Every innovation carried a cost that was carefully hidden from view. While the upper floors offered silence, space, and exclusivity, the foundations were built on displacement, labor exploitation, and rigid class separation. Entire neighborhoods were reshaped to make room for elite living, pushing working families outward, while concentrating power inward. The apartments redefined not just how the rich lived, but how the city decided who mattered. The Vanderbilt apartments also marked a turning point in American inequality. They normalized the idea that luxury could exist within shared space while remaining unreachable. That wealth could live among the masses without ever touching them. This was not coexistence, it was controlled proximity. A blueprint that would later define Park Avenue, Central Park South, and eventually the global luxury skyline. Tonight, this story is not about architecture alone. It is about intention, about how one family's quiet decisions reshaped elite life in ways still felt today. Because while the Vanderbilt fortune eventually fractured, the system they helped design endured. And long after their name faded from headlines, their apartments continued doing exactly what they were built to do, protecting power, hiding excess, and reminding the city that true privilege rarely announces itself. By the turn of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt family stood at a crossroads that few outside their world fully understood. For decades, their wealth had been expressed through spectacle, towering mansions along Fifth Avenue, sprawling estates that announced power. With every carved column and iron gate, these homes were not merely residences. They were public statements, visible proof that the Vanderbilts sat above ordinary society. Yet, as New York surged into modernity, those same mansions began to feel less like fortresses and more like liabilities. The city was changing faster than even old money could control, and the symbols of dominance that once inspired awe were starting to provoke resentment. Taxes rose, land values exploded, and maintaining massive private estates in the heart of Manhattan became increasingly impractical. More importantly, public sentiment was shifting. The Gilded Age had produced unimaginable fortunes, but it had also produced strikes, riots, and a growing distrust of industrial dynasties. Names like Vanderbilt no longer inspired universal admiration. They attracted scrutiny. The very visibility that once protected their status now exposed them to criticism. In this climate, The question was no longer how to display wealth, but how to preserve it quietly. The answer came not from desperation, but from calculation. Apartments, once considered inferior, even vulgar by high society, offered something mansions no longer could: invisibility within proximity. Elite apartment living allowed the Vanderbilts to remain in the city's most powerful districts without standing alone as targets. Surrounded by other wealthy residents, their presence blended into a collective shield of privilege. What appeared to be a step toward modern convenience was, in reality, a retreat into strategic anonymity. This transition also reflected deeper changes within elite social life itself. The old system of grand, entertaining, endless staff, and open social calendars was becoming unsustainable. Large mansions demanded armies of servants, each one a potential witness to private affairs and internal conflicts. Apartments reduced that exposure. Fewer staff, more controlled access, and architecture designed to separate owners from workers allowed elite families to live with fewer eyes watching. Privacy was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. There was also the matter of time. Industrial fortunes moved faster than aristocratic traditions. The Vanderbilts were no longer only landowners. They were investors, board members, and power brokers whose lives revolved around schedules rather than ceremonies. Apartments offered efficiency without sacrificing prestige. Centralized heating, modern plumbing, and elevator access were not conveniences for the masses. They were tools that allowed the elite to operate smoothly within an increasingly mechanized world. Yet beneath these practical reasons lay a more uncomfortable truth. Mansions symbolized permanence. Apartments symbolized flexibility. And the Vanderbilts, despite their wealth, sensed that permanence in America was fragile. Fortunes rose and fell within generations. Public opinion could turn overnight. Apartments allowed wealth to remain mobile, adaptable, and less emotionally tied to a single piece of land. They were assets, not legacies. This mindset marked a quiet psychological shift from dynastic confidence to cautious preservation. The social hierarchy also benefited from this transformation. Elite apartments created layers of access that mansions could not. In a private estate, the boundary between inside and outside was clear. In an apartment building, it became complex. Doormen, porters, service entrances, and restricted floors ensured that everyone knew their place without needing explicit enforcement. Class separation was embedded into the building itself. The structure did the work that social confrontation once required. For the Vanderbilts, this new form of living aligned perfectly with their evolving public image. Philanthropy, museums, and cultural institutions became their visible contributions, while private life retreated behind guarded lobbies and soundproof walls. They could be seen as benefactors without being seen as excess. The apartments helped rewrite the narrative from robber barons to refined patrons of civilization. This shift also mirrored broader trends among America's elite. Other dynasties watched closely. What the Vanderbilts normalized quickly became aspirational. Luxury apartments began to signal not decline, but sophistication. To live in such a building was to announce that one understood the future, that power no longer needed acreage to be absolute. The city itself became the estate, but this evolution came at a cost rarely acknowledged at the time. As elite families retreated into vertical luxury, they left behind neighborhoods hollowed out by displacement. Land assembled for apartment construction erased older communities, replacing them with structures that excluded the very city they inhabited. The Vanderbilts did not simply adapt to New York's growth. They helped shape it in ways that favored insulation over integration. By abandoning mansions for apartments, the Vanderbilts were not surrendering status. They were redefining it. They traded visibility for control, grandeur for efficiency, and tradition for adaptability. This decision would ripple far beyond their own lives, influencing how wealth interacted with urban space for generations to come. And while history often frames this shift as progress, it was also a quiet acknowledgement that in a modern city, power survives best when it learns how to hide. As the Vanderbilt apartments rose from the ground, they were engineered with a precision that went far beyond aesthetics. These buildings were not designed merely to impress. They were designed to control. Every corridor, entrance, and vertical shaft served a purpose that reflected how the elite wished to exist within a rapidly democratizing city. In an era when New York's streets were growing louder, denser, and more volatile, the apartments became instruments of separation structures that allowed wealth to remain physically present while socially removed. At street level, the illusion of accessibility was carefully maintained. Grand lobbies projected refinement without openness. Heavy doors, uniformed doormen, and controlled thresholds signaled that entry was conditional. The buildings did not need walls or gates like the old mansions had. Their defenses were procedural and psychological. One did not simply walk in. Presence had to be justified, identity confirmed, intent evaluated. Power no longer relied on distance alone, it relied on permission. Inside, architecture enforced hierarchy with quiet efficiency. Private elevators ensured that elite residents rarely crossed paths with staff or visitors. Service lifts and back staircases carried labor out of sight, preserving the illusion that luxury operated effortlessly. Soundproofing, thick walls, and strategic floor layouts eliminated the chaos of the city above and below. Even noise became a class issue, something from which wealth could insulate itself completely. Silence was not accidental. It was engineered. The floor plans themselves reflected elite anxieties. Unlike the sprawling openness of mansions, apartments were segmented, controlled, and deliberate. Rooms were designed to host selectively, not expansively. Social life moved inward, becoming more intimate and less performative. This shift reduced exposure while strengthening internal networks among the elite. Apartment living encouraged proximity among equals while maintaining absolute separation from everyone else. Perhaps most revealing was how staff were integrated into these structures. Unlike mansion servants who lived within the household, apartment staff became part of the building, not the family. Their loyalty was professional, not personal. Their movements were regulated, their visibility minimized. This arrangement protected residents from emotional entanglements and reduced the risk of scandal. Labor was present, but it was never allowed to feel close. Security in these buildings was subtle but relentless. Long before modern surveillance, architecture itself performed the role of observation. Lines of sight, controlled access points, and layered spaces ensured that residents were always protected without feeling watched. This environment fostered a sense of untouchability, reinforcing the belief that elite life existed beyond ordinary rules. The apartments did not just shelter wealth, they validated it. These design choices also reflected a growing fear among the elite, the fear of the crowd. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by strikes, protests, and public anger toward industrial fortunes. Mansions had become symbols of inequality, easy to target and impossible to conceal. Apartments dissolved individual identity into collective luxury. No single family stood alone. If resentment came, it would have no clear address. Yet the greatest innovation was psychological. The Vanderbilt apartments trained their residents to experience the city from a distance. Windows framed New York as a spectacle rather than a shared space. Streets became something to observe, not participate in. This perspective reinforced the idea that the city existed to serve wealth, not the other way around. Elite living became a form of quiet dominance, present, elevated, and unreachable. The buildings also redefined community among the wealthy. Neighbors were not accidental, they were curated. Residency required financial vetting, social compatibility, and often personal endorsement. These apartments functioned as vertical clubs, where shared status replaced shared values. Living among one's peers reinforced norms, protected reputations, and strengthened elite cohesion. The architecture did not merely house wealth, it organized it. Over time, this model proved irresistible. What the Vanderbilts pioneered became a template. Park Avenue, Central Park West, and later entire luxury districts followed the same logic. Buildings grew taller, more exclusive, more insulated. The principles remained unchanged. Separation without isolation, presence without participation, luxury without accountability. But this engineering of privacy carried consequences that extended far beyond comfort. By normalizing separation, elite apartments quietly eroded the idea of shared urban life. They taught generations of wealthy residents that a city was something to be managed, not engaged with. Public space became background, labor became invisible, and inequality became architectural. The Vanderbilt apartments were, in this sense, more than residences. They were lessons in how power adapts. They demonstrated that when wealth can no longer dominate openly, it retreats behind systems, designs, and routines that achieve the same ends more discreetly. The building stood as proof that control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it is built into the walls. And as these apartments settled into New York's skyline, they did more than protect the elite. They reshaped the city's moral geography. They marked the beginning of a world where luxury could exist alongside poverty without ever acknowledging it. A world where privacy became the ultimate privilege, and a world where the architecture of exclusion would quietly become the standard for elite living everywhere. Behind the polished entrances and hushed corridors of the Vanderbilt apartments existed a second world, one deliberately designed to remain unseen. While elite residents experienced silence, warmth, and effortless comfort, an entirely different reality sustained that illusion day and night. Luxury did not maintain itself. It was carried, cleaned, repaired, and guarded by a workforce whose presence was essential yet systematically erased. The success of elite apartment living depended not only on wealth, but on the strict control of labor and visibility. Construction alone demanded enormous human cost. Immigrant laborers, many newly arrived and desperate for work, built these structures. Under punishing conditions, safety standards were minimal, hours were long, and injuries were common. These workers laid marble floors they would never walk on freely and installed elevators they would only operate in service. Their names were never recorded, their sacrifices never commemorated. When the buildings opened, their suffering vanished. Behind limestone facades and architectural praise, once completed, the apartments required a permanent internal workforce. Doormen, porters, elevator operators, maids, cooks, laundresses, maintenance staff, all essential, all controlled. Unlike mansion servants who were visibly tied to a household, apartment workers belonged to the building itself. This distinction mattered. It stripped labor of individuality and loyalty, transforming people into functions. The system ensured that workers were always present, always necessary, and never personal. Architecture reinforced this hierarchy relentlessly. Service corridors ran parallel to main hallways, but never intersected them. Separate elevators ensured that staff moved vertically without ever sharing space with residents. Staircases hidden behind locked doors allowed labor to circulate invisibly. Even sound was managed, footsteps softened, voices muffled, activity absorbed by thick walls. The message was clear: work should never disrupt wealth's experience. Of ease, living conditions for staff reflected this imbalance. Many workers lived in cramped basement rooms or off-site housing far removed from the luxury above. Their schedules were rigid, their pay modest, and their job security fragile. A single complaint, a whispered accusation, or a perceived breach of discretion could end employment instantly. Silence was not optional, it was a condition of survival. This system relied heavily on power asymmetry. Workers knew intimate details of elite lives, routines, relationships, habits, but were expected to behave as if they knew nothing at all. The apartments functioned on enforced ignorance. To see without acknowledging, to hear without repeating. This emotional labor was as demanding as physical work, yet never recognized. Trust was demanded, but but dignity was rarely offered. The Vanderbilts and their peers justified this arrangement through distance. Apartments allowed them to believe they were removed from exploitation, even as it occurred directly beneath them. Unlike factories or railroads, the labor-sustaining elite life was quiet, domestic, and therefore easier to ignore. Inequality became internalized, normalized, and ultimately invisible. Gender played a significant role in this hidden workforce. Many domestic workers were women, often immigrants, whose labor was undervalued precisely because it occurred behind closed doors. Their work sustained not only households but reputations. They cleaned evidence of excess, concealed indiscretions, and maintained appearances that defined elite respectability. Yet their own lives remained precarious, constrained by economic dependence and social isolation. Race and class further deepened these divisions. As the 20th century progressed, minority workers increasingly filled service roles, reinforcing social boundaries through everyday interactions. Uniforms, modes of address, and behavioral expectations constantly reminded workers of their place. The building itself became a classroom where hierarchy was taught daily, subtly but relentlessly. The exploitation extended beyond wages and hours. Many workers were expected to be perpetually available, adjusting their lives around the needs of residents. Holidays, illness, and personal crises were secondary to service. The apartments demanded loyalty without reciprocity, labor without security, presence without recognition. This imbalance was not accidental, it was engineered. Yet what made the system truly effective was its quietness. There were no dramatic confrontations, no visible chains. Control was maintained through routine, dependency, and design. Workers learned the rhythms of the building, internalized its rules, and adapted themselves accordingly. Resistance was rare, not because conditions were fair, but because the cost of dissent was too high. This hidden workforce allowed elite residents to believe in the myth of self-sufficiency. Comfort appeared effortless. Order seemed natural. The city's chaos felt distant. But every polished surface and silent hallway testified to labor deliberately kept out of sight. The apartments did not eliminate exploitation, they refined it. Over time, this model spread. Other luxury buildings adopted similar systems, replicating the same divisions with increasing sophistication. The Vanderbilt apartments were not an exception. They were a prototype. They demonstrated how inequality could be embedded into everyday life, so seamlessly that it ceased to feel like injustice and all got in the end. The true darkness of elite apartment living was not cruelty, but normalization. Exploitation became routine, invisibility became policy, and silence became tradition. The buildings stood as monuments not only to wealth, but to a system that required others to disappear so that luxury could shine. And long after the Vanderbilts themselves faded from prominence, the workforce they rendered invisible remained still cleaning, still carrying, still sustaining a world that was never meant to see them dot as the Vanderbilt. Apartments solidified their place in New York's elite landscape. The family's public image underwent a careful and deliberate transformation. The same dynasty, once condemned as ruthless industrialists, began presenting itself as enlightened patrons of culture, education, and reform. Museums bore their names, universities benefited from their donations, and public institutions flourished under their financial support. To the outside world, the Vanderbilts appeared to be evolving no longer symbols of excess, but stewards of progress. Yet this polished image existed in stark contrast to the private systems that sustained their wealth and comfort. Philanthropy became a powerful tool, not only for social contribution, but for narrative control. By funding libraries, galleries, and charities, elite families reshaped how history would remember them. Public generosity softened private criticism. The same hands that underwrote cultural preservation also signed leases that enforced exclusion and displacement. The contradiction was rarely acknowledged because it was rarely visible. Charity occupied the spotlight. Exploitation remained backstage. the Vanderbilt apartments played a crucial role in maintaining this duality. They allowed elite residents to engage selectively with the public while remaining shielded from its consequences. From behind guarded lobbies and elevated views, the city could be appreciated abstractly, its struggles intellectualized rather than experienced. Reform could be discussed in drawing rooms without ever confronting the laborers cleaning those rooms at dawn. Distance made moral, inconsistency easier to tolerate. Elite reformers of the era often spoke passionately about improving urban conditions, advocating for sanitation, education, and public order. Yet these same figures benefited directly from housing models that deepened inequality. Luxury apartments concentrated resources vertically, while surrounding neighborhoods absorbed the pressures of overcrowding and rising rents. Reform addressed symptoms, not structures. The system remained intact, protected by good intentions and better public relations. This hypocrisy was not accidental. It was structural. Philanthropy functioned as a release valve, allowing wealth to redistribute small portions of itself while preserving the core mechanisms of accumulation. By funding public goods, elites could claim moral leadership without relinquishing control. The apartments embodied this logic perfectly. Private luxury, supported by public-facing benevolence. Social gatherings within these buildings reinforced the illusion. Elite residents hosted salons and charitable meetings, discussing poverty, labor, and progress from spaces built on exclusion. Conversations about reform echoed through rooms designed to prevent workers from being heard. Compassion became performative, detached from accountability. The architecture itself insulated ideals from reality. This disconnect extended into policy influence. Wealthy residents of elite apartments wielded significant political power, shaping urban development and housing regulations to their advantage. Zoning laws, building codes, and tax structures often favored luxury development under the guise of modernization. Public good and private interest blurred until they became indistinguishable. Reform became a language through which control could be exercised more subtly. The moral confidence of elite reformers was further reinforced by social consensus. Within these apartments, residents were surrounded by peers who shared similar values, experiences, and blind spots. Dissent rarely penetrated these circles. When it did, it was easily dismissed as radical or uninformed. Living among equals created an echo chamber where privilege could be rationalized collectively, even as public criticism of inequality intensified in the early 20th century. Elite apartment living allowed families like the Vanderbilts to remain insulated from direct confrontation. Protests happened in streets, not lobbies. Strikes disrupted factories, not private dining rooms. The architecture ensured that moral reckoning remained abstract, something to be discussed rather than endured. The most troubling aspect of this hypocrisy was its effectiveness. It worked. History often remembers the Vanderbilts as patrons of art and culture, more than as beneficiaries of exploitation. Buildings remained admired, donations celebrated, and contradictions softened by time. The apartments helped freeze this narrative, preserving an image of refinement that obscured the systems beneath it. Yet, cracks in this facade were always present. Workers noticed the disparity. Communities displaced by development felt the cost. Reform movements increasingly questioned whether charity could ever compensate for structural inequality. The tension between image and reality grew, even if it remained largely unspoken within elite spaces. In the end, the moral hypocrisy of elite reformers was not a failure of values, but a reflection of power. The Vanderbilt apartments demonstrated how wealth could absorb criticism without changing behavior, how reform could coexist with exclusion, and how good intentions could be used to defend unjust systems. They revealed a truth that continues to resonate today. When privilege controls both the problem and the solution, accountability becomes optional. As elite apartment living became the preferred refuge of America's wealthiest families, silence emerged as its most valuable currency. Within the Vanderbilt apartments, discretion was not merely expected, it was enforced. These buildings were designed to absorb scandal, deflect attention, and erase evidence before it could reach the street. What once would have unfolded publicly within the walls of a mansion now disappeared behind layers of controlled access. Professional loyalty and architectural isolation. Power no longer needed denial. It needed containment. Apartment living transformed how scandals were managed. In mansions, rumors traveled through servants, neighbors, and visible social gatherings. Apartments reduced exposure dramatically. Fewer staff, stricter movement, and professionalized labor minimized leaks. Dorming knew when not to look. Porters knew when not to ask. Elevators moved silently, carrying secrets as efficiently as residents. The building itself became a mechanism for suppressing disruption, affairs, financial disputes, addiction, and mental health crises. Realities that existed in every class were handled differently at the top. Elite apartments allowed these issues to be addressed quietly, often with money rather than accountability. Private doctors entered through service doors. Legal counsel arrived unnoticed. Problems were solved vertically, not publicly. The city remained unaware, and reputation remained intact. This environment also enabled social control within elite circles. Residents knew that their neighbors shared both status and vulnerability. Mutual silence became a form of insurance. Exposing another scandal risked inviting scrutiny of one's own. The apartments fostered a culture of unspoken agreements where discretion was rewarded and exposure was punished. This collective silence strengthened elite cohesion more effectively than loyalty ever could. Women often bore the heaviest burden of this secrecy. In a society obsessed with reputation, elite women were expected to embody perfection while navigating private constraints. Apartments provided privacy, but also confinement. Emotional distress, unhappy marriages, and social pressure were hidden behind elegant interiors. When boundaries were crossed, blame was often absorbed quietly, resolved internally, and erased from public memory. Silence preserved male power and female compliance. Financial scandals followed a similar pattern. Questionable investments, insider dealings, and inheritance disputes were negotiated behind closed doors. Apartment living allowed these conflicts to remain invisible while fortunes quietly shifted hands. Legal battles rarely spilled into the public eye, not because wrongdoing was absent, but because exposure was expensive for everyone involved. The buildings themselves played a psychological role in enforcing control. Isolation bred conformity. Residents learned which topics were safe, which behaviors acceptable, and which truths dangerous. The architecture encouraged inward focus, reducing engagement with the broader city where dissent and exposure might originate. Elite life became self-referential, self-protecting, and increasingly detached from public accountability. Even death was handled differently. Illnesses were concealed. Tragic ends were reframed. Obituaries emphasized legacy over circumstance. The apartments provided the space and privacy needed to manage grief without public spectacle. What happened inside reshaped how history remembered those who lived there. This culture of silence extended to the workforce. Staff who witnessed indiscretions understood the consequences of speaking. Employment contracts, informal threats, and economic dependence ensured compliance. Stories died in hallways before reaching daylight. The cost of silence was built into the system, distributed unevenly but enforced universally. Over time, this suppression of scandal reshaped elite behavior itself. When consequences disappear, boundaries erode. The apartments did not create moral decay, but they made it safer. They reduced friction, lowered risk, and normalized secrecy as a lifestyle. Power became quieter, not cleaner. This model would be replicated endlessly. From Park Avenue to global financial capitals, luxury residences adopted the same principles. Control through discretion, protection through design, silence through dependency. What began as a solution to urban density evolved into a technology of reputation management. Yet, the most unsettling truth is how effective it was. Scandals faded before they formed. Accountability dissolved into negotiation. History recorded refinement instead of reality. The Vanderbilt apartments did not just house elite life, they curated it, filtering out anything that threatened the image of controlled dot in the end. Silence was not a side effect of elite apartment living. It was its purpose. And within those quiet walls, power learned a lesson it would never forget, that the greatest privilege is not wealth, but the ability to make truths disappear, as the Vanderbilt apartments settled into the fabric of New York. Their influence extended far beyond the lives of the families who first occupied them. These buildings quietly redefined the very meaning of comfort, dignity, and entitlement in an urban society. Before this shift, luxury had been understood as an extension of land space to expand, grounds to retreat into, walls to separate the powerful from the rest. Apartment living inverted that logic. It suggested that true privilege was no longer measured by how much one owned, but by how effectively one could control access within shared space. This idea would permanently alter who was perceived as deserving of a refined life. The transformation began subtly. Elite apartments were marketed not simply as residences, but as environments designed for a superior way of living. Clean air, silence, privacy, and order were framed as achievements rather than basic human needs. By embedding these qualities into exclusive buildings, they became commodities rather than rights. The city outside grew louder and more crowded, while the apartments inside grew calmer and more insulated. Comfort was no longer something society should strive to provide broadly. It became something to be earned, purchased, and protected. This shift carried profound cultural consequences. As elite living standards rose within these controlled environments, expectations elsewhere fell. Overcrowding in working-class neighborhoods was normalized. Noise, disorder, and scarcity were framed as inevitable features of ordinary life, rather than failures of policy or planning. The contrast reinforced a dangerous narrative that discomfort was a natural condition for some, while serenity was a reward reserved for others. Architecture did not merely reflect inequality. It taught it. The Vanderbilt apartments also redefined respectability. To live in such a building signaled not only wealth, but belonging to a moral category deemed worthy of refinement. Residents were assumed to be responsible, cultured, and civilized by virtue of their address alone. Meanwhile, those excluded from these spaces were implicitly framed as less deserving of comfort or privacy. The line between economic status and moral worth blurred until it became indistinguishable. This redefinition of elite living had generational impact. Children raised in these apartments inherited not just wealth, but expectations. They grew up believing that silence, security, and personal space were normal and that disorder existed elsewhere, managed by others. This worldview shaped how future elites approached governance, business, and social responsibility. When discomfort was invisible, empathy became abstract. The spatial organization of elite apartments reinforced these beliefs daily. Separate entrances, restricted floors, and controlled common areas taught residents who belonged where without words. Even within the building, hierarchy was preserved. Larger units occupied higher floors. Views became status markers. Vertical space translated into social elevation. Living well was no longer horizontal and expansive. It was stratified and ranked out as this model spread. It influenced urban development across America. Cities began catering to elite expectations rather than collective needs. Luxury developments promised sanctuary from urban life instead of engagement with it. Parks, services, and infrastructure increasingly followed wealth, reinforcing spatial inequality. The idea that some deserved peace while others endured chaos became embedded in the city's design. The Vanderbilt apartments also reshaped the psychology of aspiration. For those outside elite circles, luxury apartment living became a symbol of success. Yet this aspiration was built on exclusion. To rise meant leaving others behind, not lifting them alongside. The dream of elite living required separation as its final proof. Comfort achieved collectively was no longer impressive. Comfort achieved at a distance was Media and culture amplified this narrative. Newspapers praised architectural innovation while ignoring displacement. Society pages celebrated elite residences as milestones of progress. Rarely did they question who was excluded or what was lost. Over time, elite apartment living became synonymous with modernity itself. To critique, it was to appear backward or resentful. This cultural normalization masked the moral implications. If comfort was framed as a personal achievement, then discomfort could be framed as personal failure. Structural inequality disappeared behind individual narratives of success and ambition. The Vanderbilt apartments helped shift responsibility away from systems and onto individuals. Weakening calls for reform. Even language changed. Words like luxury, privacy, and security became aspirational rather than universal. Housing ceased to be a shared civic concern and became a market product. The elite did not just live differently, they redefined the terms by which everyone else measured their lives. Yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological distance. Elite apartment living taught those inside that separation was not only acceptable, but necessary. The city became something to manage, not belong to. Social problems became topics, not experiences. Compassion could exist, but only from afar. This mindset would shape philanthropy, policy, and power for decades as the 20th century progressed. The Vanderbilt apartments stood as quiet instructors in this new moral order. They demonstrated that redefining elite living was not about space, but about perception. About convincing society that serenity was scarce, privacy was premium, and inequality was natural. Once these ideas took root, they no longer required defense. In redefining who deserved to live well. The Vanderbilt apartments did something more lasting than build luxury homes. They reshaped values. They taught a growing nation that comfort could be exclusive without being questioned. That separation could be elegant, and that inequality could be beautifully designed. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy far more powerful than stone or steel, a blueprint for how privilege justifies itself. One quiet floor at a time. By the time the Vanderbilt name began to lose its dominance in American society, the buildings associated with it had already learned how to survive without the family itself. This was one of the great ironies of elite apartment living. The dynasty that helped popularize this model of power slowly fractured, fortunes divided. Heirs diluted, influence dispersed, yet the structures they helped create endured with remarkable stability. The Vanderbilt apartments did not decline with the family. They adapted, absorbed new owners, and continued to function exactly as intended. The causes of the Vanderbilt decline were complex and familiar. Enormous wealth, once concentrated, was scattered across generations through inheritance, mismanagement, taxation, and changing economic conditions. The industrial age that created the fortune gave way to new industries where old dynasties held less control. Public attitudes shifted, and the cultural authority of inherited wealth weakened. The Vanderbilt name faded from headlines, becoming a historical reference rather than a living power. But the apartments were immune to this erosion. Unlike mansions, which demanded constant upkeep and emotional attachment, luxury apartment buildings were designed as assets. They did not rely on family continuity or personal legacy. Ownership could change hands quietly. Management could professionalize. Revenue could be stabilized through rents and maintenance fees. The buildings were not monuments, they were systems. This distinction proved crucial. As grand Vanderbilt mansions were demolished or repurposed, elite apartment buildings remained profitable, functional, and desirable. They did not require nostalgia to justify their existence. Their value was practical, not symbolic. They continued to offer what elites wanted most: privacy, security, and insulation from the city. As long as those needs existed, the buildings would remain relevant. New occupants arrived with different names but similar expectations. Financiers, industrialists, and later executives moved into spaces once associated with old money. The apartments welcomed them without ceremony. No lineage was required, only capital. This transition marked a subtle shift in elite culture from inherited dominance to transactional privilege. Power became more fluid, but no less exclusive. The buildings themselves facilitated this evolution. Their architecture was adaptable, their systems modernizable, interiors could be renovated, amenities updated, and services expanded without altering the core principles of separation and control. The apartments evolved with technology while preserving their social function. They aged without appearing. Old, this adaptability contrasted sharply with the fate of the Vanderbilt family. While the name diminished, the logic it embodied persisted. The apartments continued to enforce the same hierarchies, the same invisibility of labor, and the same culture of discretion. In many ways, they preserved the family's influence more effectively than bloodlines ever could. There was also a psychological shift in how legacy was understood. Buildings outlived individuals, and in doing so, they redefined permanence. The Vanderbilts may have lost their singular dominance, but the structures they helped popularize became templates replicated across cities and continents. Their decline was personal. Their impact was systemic. Urban landscapes reflected this transition. Where once elite neighborhoods were defined by family names, they became defined by building names, addresses, and price points. Prestige detached from ancestry and attached itself to real estate. The city remembered structures, not stories. This shift favored systems over dynasties, continuity over lineage. Yet the survival of these apartments also masked loss. As family influence waned, accountability dissolved further. Buildings had no memory of how wealth was created or at whose expense. They operated efficiently, indifferent to history. This amnesia allowed new elites to inhabit old power without inheriting its moral burden. The transformation was quiet and unremarkable, which made it more profound. No dramatic collapse marked the end of the Vanderbilt era. Instead, there was a gradual fading, absorbed by the city's constant renewal. The apartments continued to stand unchanged in purpose as if nothing had happened at all. This phenomenon revealed a deeper truth about modern power. It no longer depends on names or narratives. It depends on infrastructure. The Vanderbilt apartments demonstrated that when privilege is built into systems rather than personalities, it becomes resilient. It survives scandal, decline, and generational failure. Over time, the buildings themselves became symbols of stability in a volatile world. Markets fluctuated, families rose and fell, but the apartments remained desirable. They offered predictability, order, and control qualities that transcend individual fortunes. In doing so, they became anchors for elite life long after the original elites disappeared. The irony was complete. The Vanderbilts had sought privacy and insulation, and in the end, their influence was preserved precisely because it detached from them. The apartments no longer needed the family. They had learned how to function autonomously, enforcing the same social boundaries without a name-attached dot. In this way, the decline of the Vanderbilt dynasty did not weaken the system they helped create. It strengthened it. By removing the human element, the buildings became pure expressions of elite logic, efficient, quiet, and unaccountable. They stood as proof that while families fade, structures endure. And as the city continued to evolve around them, these apartments whispered a subtle lesson to every new occupant. Power is most secure when it no longer depends on who you are, but on where you live. By the early decades of the 20th century, the transformation set in motion by the Vanderbilt apartments had spread far beyond a single family or a single city. What began as a solution to urban inconvenience evolved into a blueprint for elite living that reshaped cities across America. The logic was simple, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Concentrate wealth vertically. Separate power from the street. Replace public presence with controlled access. Once proven successful, this model could not be contained. It replicated itself wherever money, density, and ambition intersected. New York became the testing ground. But Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and later Los Angeles quickly followed. Luxury apartment buildings rose along prestigious corridors, each promising privacy without isolation and prestige without exposure. Developers studied the Vanderbilt model carefully. They learned which details mattered and which were decorative. The doorman was essential. The service entrance was non-negotiable. Elevators needed to separate residents from labor. Layouts had to discourage casual interaction with outsiders. The result was not just housing, but hierarchy rendered in stone and steel. This architectural shift subtly altered how elites related to cities themselves. Mansions had tied families to neighborhoods. Apartments tied them to addresses. Identity became locational rather than familial. Saying where you lived replaced saying who you were. Prestige compressed into numbers, floors, and views. Power became abstract, mobile, and harder to trace. You could move into elite space without carrying elite history. The model also changed how wealth moved. Apartments were liquid assets. They could be bought, sold, inherited, leveraged, and divided without emotional attachment. This made elite life more adaptable to economic change. Fortunes no longer needed to sustain entire estates. They only needed to sustain access. As long as you could afford the address, the system welcomed you. This flexibility allowed new money to integrate quickly. Industrialists were followed by financiers, then executives, then global capital. Apartments erased the awkward transition from outsider to insider. There was no gatekeeper beyond money itself. The building did not care where wealth came from. It only enforced who could stay. The implications were profound. Cities that once displayed wealth through visible opulence now concealed it behind uniform facades. Luxury became harder to identify from the street. Inequality did not vanish, it withdrew. This withdrawal reduced friction. Protests targeted factories and offices, not residential towers. Anger aimed outward, rarely upward. The Vanderbilt apartments also influenced global architecture. European cities adapted the model cautiously, blending it with older traditions of aristocratic flats. In Asia and the Middle East, luxury high-rises adopted the same principles with modern materials. The logic transcended culture because it addressed a universal elite desire, separation without exile. Over time, this architecture reshaped social behavior. Elites interacted less with the city and more with each other. Social life migrated indoors. Clubs, dining rooms, gyms, and salons replaced streets and squares. The apartment building became a self-contained ecosystem, reducing dependence on public space. Cities grew denser, but social distance increased. The psychological effects were subtle but lasting. Living above the city altered perception. Noise became distant. Crowds became abstract. Problems below felt theoretical. Height reinforced hierarchy. The higher you lived, the less visible the consequences of inequality became. Architecture trained perspective. This detachment influenced politics as well. Elites living in insulated spaces experienced fewer daily reminders of urban struggle. Policy became conceptual rather than experiential. Decisions affected people they rarely encountered. The physical separation translated into emotional distance, reinforcing cycles of misunderstanding and indifference. Yet, the system was remarkably stable. Economic crashes came and went. Wars reshaped nations. Social movements challenged privilege. The buildings endured. They adapted, renovated, rebranded, but never relinquished their core function. Each generation inherited not just apartments, but a way of seeing the world. The Vanderbilt apartments did not merely change where elites lived. They changed how power reproduced itself. By embedding privilege into architecture, they ensured continuity without effort. Children grew up assuming separation was normal. Privacy felt deserved. Access felt earned. The system perpetuated itself quietly. Critics occasionally noticed. Writers described cities hollowed out at the top. Sociologists warned of vertical segregation. But the model offered too many advantages to abandon. Even critics wanted in. The buildings absorbed dissent as easily as they absorbed wealth. As the 20th century progressed, the model merged with new technologies. Security systems, private garages, climate control, and later digital surveillance refined isolation further. Apartments became fortresses disguised as homes. The street receded even more. By the end of the century, elite apartment living was no longer a novelty. It was the default. Mansions became museum pieces or trophies. True power lived behind shared walls, protected by contracts and cameras rather than gates and guards. The Vanderbilt legacy was complete. What made this transformation dark was not its efficiency, but its invisibility. Cities appeared vibrant and accessible while their most powerful residents withdrew from shared experience. Democracy persisted, but intimacy faded. The built environment normalized separation. The Vanderbilt apartments had not set out to change the world. They simply solved a problem for a powerful family. But in doing so, they revealed a truth that reshaped cities everywhere. That architecture is not neutral. It encodes values, distributes power, and teaches behavior. Long after the Vanderbilt name lost its dominance, the system it helped pioneer thrived. The buildings continued to rise. The city continued to grow upward. And with each new floor added, the distance between those who lived above and those who lived below became easier to accept. This was the true legacy. Not marble halls or famous residents, but a way of organizing society that made inequality feel orderly, manageable, and permanent. The Vanderbilt apartments did not just redefine elite living. They redefined how elites could exist within cities without truly belonging to them. And once that idea took hold, there was no going back. In the end, the story of the Vanderbilt apartments is not really about a building or even a family. It is about a shift in how power learned to survive. The apartments stand as evidence that dominance does not need to announce itself to endure. It only needs systems that protect it from exposure, friction, and consequence. What the Vanderbilts helped create was not just elite housing, but a method one that quietly outlived their fortune and continues to shape the modern world. By the time the 20th century drew to a close, the logic first refined in those early luxury apartments had become so normalized that few questioned it. Vertical separation, controlled access, professionalized discretion, and privatized comfort were no longer luxuries. They were expectations. The idea that the most powerful people in a city might live entirely disconnected from its daily realities felt ordinary, even sensible. Architecture had trained society to accept it. The darkness of this legacy lies in how subtle it is. There was no single moment when elites withdrew from public life. No announcement that wealth would now live above, behind, and apart. It happened incrementally, disguised as progress, convenience, and modernization. Apartments were marketed as efficient, elegant solutions to urban density. Their social consequences remained unspoken. Over time, these buildings reshaped not only where elites lived, but how cities functioned. Urban planning increasingly catered to private interests rather than public needs. Streets became conduits rather than gathering places. Neighborhoods hollowed out as wealth concentrated vertically. The city remained crowded, but communal life thinned. People shared space without sharing experience. This separation carried psychological weight. When power no longer encounters hardship directly, empathy becomes optional. When wealth is buffered from consequence, accountability weakens. The apartments did not create inequality, but they softened its visibility, making it easier to ignore and harder to challenge. What cannot be seen rarely feels urgent. The Vanderbilt apartments also revealed how permanence truly works. Families fall. Industries fade. Fortunes disperse. But systems designed for continuity endure. These buildings were never meant to depend on one name or one era. They were adaptable by design. Their survival proved that power embedded in infrastructure is far more resilient than power tied to people. As new generations moved in, the original story faded. Residents knew the address, not the history. They enjoyed the benefits without inheriting the context. This amnesia was not accidental. It was essential. Remembering how systems are built invites questions about who they serve. Forgetting allows them to function smoothly. In this way, the apartments became self-justifying. Their existence implied legitimacy. If such buildings were everywhere, then surely they were natural. The line between choice and inevitability blurred. Elite separation felt less like privilege and more like an architectural fact. The same logic now governs global cities. From London to Dubai, from Hong Kong to New York, luxury towers replicate the same principles. Different styles, same outcome. Wealth floats above the street, insulated from instability, buffered by security and service. The Vanderbilt experiment went global. Technology intensified this trend. Digital access replaced physical presence. Deliveries arrive without interaction. Remote work reduced the need to engage with the city at all. The apartment became a command center rather than a home. Power could operate without touching the ground. Yet, the cost of this separation accumulates quietly. Cities strain under inequality they cannot fully see. Social trust erodes when shared spaces lose shared meaning. Resentment grows in gaps left unaddressed. The buildings stand firm, but the fabric around them weakens. The Vanderbilt apartments did not invent this outcome, but they accelerated it. They demonstrated that elite comfort and urban proximity could coexist without engagement. That lesson proved irresistible. It offered the benefits of the city without its obligations. What makes the story unsettling is how elegant the solution was. No force was required. No walls topped with barbed wire. Just doors, elevators, contracts, and silence. The system worked because it felt reasonable. It still does. Today, when people speak of elite living, they rarely mention responsibility. They talk about views, amenities, security, exclusivity. The language reflects the shift. Citizenship has been replaced by access. Belonging by ownership. Community by management. The Vanderbilts themselves would likely be surprised by how thoroughly their influence detached from them. Their name faded, but their idea thrived. They sought comfort and control in a changing city. What they left behind was a blueprint for modern privilege. This is why the story matters. Not as nostalgia, and not as scandal, but as a warning about how environments shape values. Architecture teaches behavior. It normalizes separation. It rewards silence. And once embedded, it resists reform. The apartments still stand, not as relics, but as living systems. People move in. Lives unfold. Power circulates. The city below it gaps around them. Do you pause to ask what has been lost in exchange for this efficiency? Perhaps the darkest part of the story is not that elites withdrew, but that the rest of society learned to accept it. The buildings did not just shelter wealth. They reshaped expectations of what urban life should look like. In the shadow of these towers, inequality feels distant, abstract, structural rather than personal. And that distance is the true luxury they provide. Not space, not comfort, but separation from consequence. The Vanderbilt apartments redefined elite living by proving that power does not need visibility to persist. It only needs architecture willing to protect it and a society willing to stop looking up.